Well, welcome everyone. My name is Stephen Millard. I'm the Deputy Director for Macroeconomic Modelling and Forecasting at the National Institute. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you today to this seminar/discussion about land taxes. Back in 2010-11, Sir James Mirrlees was asked to do a review, or did a review of taxation in the United Kingdom, and it was very wide-reaching. But one of the things that came out of that was yet again the argument that we should move to taxing land rather than property, in particular, actually taxing business property, as business property is an input into production, and so, at least according to economic theory, shouldn't be taxed. Land, on the other hand, is pure economic rent, and in that sense should be taxed. So that was the conclusion that came out of the report. Of course, nothing has changed since then, and we're still not taxing land, and we are still taxing business property. So we thought it would be really good to have a couple of experts talk to us to make the case for land taxes in the UK, to actually quantify how beneficial land taxes may be on the back of work that they have already done for the United States. In a minute, I'm going to hand over to Michael, who's going to present the paper. Charles Goodhart, who I'm sure everyone knows, will then give a few words at the end of the presentation. We will then open up to questions. If you have questions as you're listening to the presentation, then please do feel free to put them into the chat, and then I will make sure that they get asked during the Q&A after the talk. I think that's all I need to say for now, so I'm going to hand over to Michael Kumhof, who is going to present the work on the case for land tax in the United Kingdom. Michael, over to you.
Michael, you're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
We can indeed.
Okay, good. So thank you to NISA for giving us the opportunity to present this work here. As Steve just mentioned, this is a paper that came out as a CEPR discussion paper, and the case study was for the United States, although it contained data for several other countries, including the UK. But today, the actual application of the quantitative exercise is to the UK economy. The original set of co-authors is myself, Nicolaus Tideman from Virginia Tech, Michael Hudson, Missouri at Kansas City, and Charles Goodhart, whom you all know. For the UK, we were joined by Urvish Patel from NISA. So the motivation behind this work is that many economies are experiencing major fiscal stress post the corona, and also still dragging on from the GFC of global financial crisis of 2008. And the question that we asked ourselves is, how can economies accomplish two fiscal policy objectives, namely, one, to finance high and growing expenditures without even further increasing debt, while two, nevertheless stimulating the economy despite the constraint on debt. And in this paper, the proposal or the strategy is to do so by a balanced budget, so not increasing debt any further is thereby ensured, and by shifting taxes to the value of land from the incomes mainly of labor and capital. And the most important points, and we will come across them throughout the presentation, is that the land tax base is very large. It's about 250% of UK GDP, similar elsewhere, far larger, by the way, in Australia, as I will show. The distortionary effects of other taxes, meaning mostly income taxes, are very large. And thirdly, several percentage point, and specifically 5 percentage point increase in the land value tax can increase GDP by incredibly large numbers by the standards of this literature. I will qualify that later on, but we get a result of 40% in the very long run, spread out over a very long period of time. So this doesn't all happen, of course, in one instant. The original paper, as I mentioned, was applied to the US, but here we use the UK data. Brief history of the idea. One book that I particularly like is by Linklater, who showed that most societies in history did not think it was possible to own individual rights to the earth. But here we are. We have a society where there are individual rights to the earth. Concerning that, Locke said that justice dictates that land should not be freely available when scarce, that humans are in an equal moral position with respect to the benefits of land. So his argument was a moral, ethical type argument. And the equal position can be reached through equal ownership of the land rent without necessarily having the ownership of the land itself vested in society as a whole, but the land rent should be at least to some extent. Now, this idea has a very, very long and distinguished line of advocates, starting with the physiocrats, Adam Smith, Ricardo, the Mills, Henry George, and more recently, names like Marshall, Walras, Ramsey, Pigou, Friedman, Tobin, Buchanan, etc., and Joe Stiglitz, who has written about this not too long ago. Now, theory, first a few basic concepts, and then we get into more detail. When we say land, we include in that idea surface land, but also water, air, sunlight, the electromagnetic spectrum. The only things that are excluded are people and their products, and in economic jargon, that would typically be labor and capital. Not typically, that would be labor and capital. When we talk about the flow income of land, we distinguish the rental value from the actual net return. The actual net return is obviously something you can measure. The rental value is a theoretical concept. It is the opportunity cost of leaving an unused site unused, or alternatively, the income if the site were to be used to its highest and best use, because that is independent of the actual actions of the landowner. It's a lump sum concept. And so if you tax it, it's a lump sum tax. Similarly, for the stock value of land, you need to distinguish what we call the asset value of land from the present discounted value of planned net income. And basically what that represents is the present discounted value of rental values, including capital gains of land. And again, that represents the market value of land in its highest and best use. And again, that is a lump sum concept and therefore does not affect incentives. Now, this has several important aspects, only some of which I can talk about, others are dealt with in the paper. For example, I'm not going to talk about the financial sector aspects. I'm not going to talk about some very important environmental aspects, positive, of land value taxation. I'm going to talk about efficiency and income distribution. On efficiency, there's a number of allocative neutrality propositions around. The oldest one, which is in this paper also, is that land taxes that are independent of land's actual use are allocatively neutral in the sense that if I raise that tax and do nothing else, then I will not affect economic incentives. An alternative was proposed by Gaffney back in the early 70s, namely to include the full rental value of land in the base of the income tax. That's not what we're going to talk about. And there are other allocative neutrality propositions in the theoretical literature, but some of them can get quite involved. Now, then the question is, can we do better than neutrality? And in this paper, yes, we can, very much better, but through balanced budget reductions in other taxes that are distortionary. But there are other reasons to think this might be better than neutral. For example, going back to Brown and then continuing with several publications by our co-author Nick Tideman, is that this tax would lead to a reduction of inefficient land speculation. And third point made by Foldvary and others is that a land tax could be a reliable base for an SOE, small open economy, because other tax bases can run to other jurisdictions or to tax havens. The land cannot pack up and run. It is there and can be taxed. That was efficiency. Inequality. There's an AER paper by Knoll et al. Who argue that most of the increase in capital to income ratios that we have recently observed is due to housing wealth, and that surge in housing wealth in turn is mostly due to land prices, not to structures. Stiglitz revisits the Kaldor facts and argues that what we are faced with these days is flat returns on labor and capital, but an increasing capital share and an increasing wealth to income ratio. And he argues that this can only be explained by accounting for rents. And he then concludes by arguing that land taxes can contribute to reduced wealth inequality. Inequality being a major and important topic. So this is a key consideration. But we will, in the paper, we deal briefly with inequality, but in today's talk, I will only talk about this, about efficiency. Let's turn to the data, and this is just a first quick look. The main points I'm going to make is that the tax base is very large. We rely on OECD data. They started putting together a working group in 2012 and started putting out those data a few years later for some countries where good data are available. And they find that the tax base is about as large as the capital stock. To give you an idea, in the United States, the capital stock is roughly 240% of GDP. We're not saying that part of that is actually land. No, capital is capital. It's the 240% of GDP. But in addition to that, there is a stock of non-produced real assets that is land, and that in the United States is 250% of GDP, which incidentally is very similar to the UK. There are also numerous empirical studies, especially for the US and Australia. Australia especially, but also the US. Then the second main point is that the tax base can be reliably estimated. This has been a sticking point, a methodological sticking point. There are established systems for separately valuing land and structures on the land that exist in the US, very much so in Australia, who actually have a land tax system and have had it for 100 years. Japan and South Korea also have established systems, but I know it's less obvious to compare those systems to ours. But the US and Australia, one could have a look at that. And B, modern mass appraisal methods are becoming better and better. So with computerized techniques, it is possible to produce land value maps that can help in assessing land values. Nobody's claiming it's easy, but it is doable, which is also stated, by the way, in the Merlis review. The main valuation approaches, I'm leaving one out, which is relatively minor, the land to structure ratios. I'm focusing on the direct cadastral approach, which is a physical bottom-up inventory that is done in Japan and South Korea. They have the highest quality data, I would argue. Then there's the hedonic approach, which is basically a regression model for a land price index that depends on a number of characteristics of the site. This is very promising for mass appraisals and land value maps. Then there is the land residual method, which takes the overall value of the parcel of land, including the structures, and deducts from that the structure replacement value. And what's left over is the land that is most commonly used, including in the US, but is highly flawed and tends to highly underestimate the value of land. And I'll talk about that in a second. Then there's the building residual method, where you do the opposite. You take the overall value, and then you deduct from that the land value estimate that you have arrived at by some combination of the first or the second approach on this slide. And then the structure is the residual. And that is actually economically the correct thing to do. Why is the land residual method economically not correct? Structures cannot be attributed any value independently of their location. because you cannot take the structure away from the location and trade it and put it somewhere else. Therefore, you need to determine land values directly and first, and the driver of land values is improved surroundings, easier credit, etc. Easier credit is dealt with at length in the paper, but I don't have time for it here. And the key consideration is location, location, location. That's what determines land values. The mechanisms for land valuations, as I already said, already exist in not all, but in some major economies. And then the value of structures in that location should be the residual, but the BEA data in the United States only permit to do the opposite, which is the land residual method. The key distinction economically in this distinction between land and building residual is between the cost of production and the value in use of a structure. For new structures, the cost and the value are very close to each other, but for older structures, there is economic depreciation related to physical wear and tear, but much more importantly in many cases due to what is known as locational obsolescence. So you could have a perfectly serviceable building on a site, but nevertheless the owner wants to knock it down because given the site's current surroundings, there are much better uses for that site. And that means that the structure was actually worth nothing, though, even though if you valued it at replacement value, it would be worth a lot. And that's the kind of mistake you make by using the building residual, the land residual method. Now let's look at some OECD data on land shares. They are produced using a variety of methods. Some of them are land residual, and therefore they may still be underestimating the land share. When I say land share, I mean land, value of land divided by the sum of the value of land and the value of capital, meaning machinery, structures, equipment, etc., etc. Here is Australia, including natural resources. It's nearly 50%. So half of the physical stuff out there is not physical capital, but it is land and natural resources in the case of Australia, because they have a lot of natural resources. Similarly, for Canada, it's nearly 50%. If you look at that green line, which includes natural resources. UK, these are the figures from the OECD database for the UK, 55 to 60% in the most recent data period. Here's the US. We constructed this ourselves. This is not from the OECD, 51.1%, and there are various reasons that we list for why this may be still a severe underestimate. So we're talking about a huge tax base, because as soon as this is above 50%, and given that we know that capital is about 240% of GDP, you know that land is more than 240% of GDP. And let's look also at Australian land to GDP ratio. So that's a different measure. Just how large is the value of land relative to GDP? Look on the left-hand side. More recently, 350% or more. And this is not from some unreliable data source. This is directly from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So the tax base is very large in some major economies. So now what we do is to build a model in order to quantify the effects. We have households that consume and supply labor and accumulate capital and hold land. When they supply labor, by the way, it's important to mention this. We model this in such a way that their labor supply responds to the after-tax real wage, but it does not respond to their consumption or their ability to consume goods. So it's a specific kind of preference. So that means that when they get richer, they do not necessarily want to take some of that wealth in the form of more leisure because they respond mostly to the real wage. Then the model has 6 taxes, 3 income taxes on capital, land, and labor on the income from those. So that's on a flow, where we separately have marginal and average tax rates, where marginal rates determine allocation and average rates determine tax revenues and therefore the government's budget and its ability to shift between different tax bases, which is, both of those are very important in the model, and we're very careful about calibrating this. Then we have a consumption tax, where average is equal to marginal, and we have taxes on the value of assets separately for capital and land, and again, their average is equal to marginal. Okay. Then we have firms. They produce and they have a production function in labor, capital, and land. So the important thing is that land is the third factor of production. And this is not completely unprecedented. And there's a literature that we can rely on to calibrate the substitutability between land and other factors, and our own data in order to calibrate the share of land in overall production. Then we have the government has a budget. Government spending and transfers exogenously grow at the trend growth rate of the economy. Then tax revenue adjusts to finance spending. And then if you change one tax, you change the others so that the budget remains balanced. Tax reform will consist in today's talk exclusively of an exogenous variation of the tax rate on the market value of land, not on the flow income of land. And budget balance is then restored through the tax rate on the capital rental, and the tax rate on labor income adjusts proportionally with the tax rate on the capital rental. So the two main tax rates on income are reduced when the tax rate on land is increased. And we calibrate the model. We did this with Urvish for the UK national accounts, 2019 annual frequency. Here are the values for the asset stocks for the UK. The land to GDP ratio is 245%, very similar to the US. Capital to GDP is quite a bit less than the US, 205%. The land share is 54.5%. That is very similar to what we find in the OECD database. Taxes, we have an extremely detailed analysis that matches the model categories exactly. We have consumption taxes, which in our model are all taxes on products, where the average and marginal tax rate is 23.4%. It's quite high, but it is matched exactly to national accounts data if you model all taxes on products as and production, which is not so large, as consumption taxes. Raises quite a bit of revenue too. Then we have asset value taxes, where we include in that stamp duty, council tax, and business rates. That's 0.8%, with the tax base being the value of the underlying asset. That does not raise very much tax revenue, but it's 3.6% relative to GDP. And labor income tax rate, including national insurance, marginal rate of 34%, average rate is about a third less, and the tax revenue is pretty large, about the same as for consumption taxes. And capital and land income tax rate marginal rate is over 50%. Again, this is based on the national accounts. Average rate is lower. Tax revenue, however, and this is important, is only 6.5%, meaning because we all know that capital taxes are really bad for incentives. We're only raising 6.5% with it. It would not take that much of a shift of the tax composition in order to replace this with something else. That's, I guess, one of the most important points. So now we do simulations. We start with what we call a baseline LAVT, land asset value tax. We assume that this reform is phased in linearly over 20 years, because to do it all in one go is probably not going to be politically feasible if it is ever to take place. We are showing simulations that show 80 years from the initial implementation. That is because this is basically a structural reform. It will lead to a lot of capital accumulation that takes time to be reflected in macroeconomic variables. In all cases, we assume that spending is held constant relative to trend. Then for tax rates, what do we assume? We assume the land asset value tax rate goes from 0.8% to 5.8%. It's sizable, but not astronomical. The capital asset value tax remains unchanged. So if you have a site with a building on it, you leave the tax on the building the same, but you increase the tax on the underlying land. Capital and land income tax rates go from over 50% to close to 0%. Labor income tax rate from 34% marginal to close to 0%. The consumption tax rate is left unchanged. And this is based on the idea that while a land tax is the least distortionary tax, the second least distortionary tax is generally known to be the consumption tax. So we leave that unchanged for this simulation. The output gain we get, I'm going to show you, is nearly 40% in the very long run relative to trend. The price of land drops by around 40% in the short run, but by less than 10% in the long run. Let's look at this in picture form. This is the reform. I have all four reforms that I'm going to show you today all in one picture. And I'm going to highlight what I'm actually talking about. And it's the black lines, solid ones that I'm talking about here, where top left, you have the land value tax goes from 0.8 to 5.8%. And at the bottom, you see the capital and labor income tax rates going from values above 50 and above 30% to very close to zero in the very, very long run. Takes some time, however. What do we observe for GDP? GDP increases on a sustained basis by 40% over 80 years. So this is about a 0.5% percentage points added to the growth rate every year, and more in the short run and a bit less in the long run. The land price drops by 40% in the short run and 10% in the long run. So there's a political concern always. That's one of the concerns with land taxes about what's happening to the land price. And some of the other simulations are going to address that. So we do some sensitivity analysis, starting with wealth taxes that are now being talked about in some jurisdictions, unfortunately, we would argue. And that is where you still increase the tax on asset values by 5 percentage points total, but you split it half and half between taxes on land and taxes on capital. So those tax rates remain the same. This again allows you to reduce all income taxes to close to zero, and the consumption tax can drop just a little bit. But in this case, the output gain is only 28%. The reason is, compared to 40% previously, the reason is that the incentives for labor supply improve because the labor income tax is basically abolished, but the incentives for capital improve quite a bit less. And that is because while I reduce the capital income tax rate, I increase the capital asset value tax rate, and quite substantially. And so you see this here, this is the red dotted line in this chart. You see that GDP increases quite a bit less than for the black solid line. And if you look at the reasons, it's mostly capital, not so much labor, because by taxing buildings and machinery, you're disincentivizing production and construction of property. The land price, however, in this case, only drops by a little bit more than 13% in the short run and increases by 18% in the long run. Because despite this fact that this tax taxes capital, the overall effects on incentives are still so positive that all asset values rise, including the price of land, in the very long run when the full productivity effects of this shock have shown through. Next, we look at what we call constrained optimal taxes, where we increase the land asset value tax to a cap of 20% on the value of asset, which is a very large number. If you do a purely theoretical experiment, you would basically drive that even higher to get to the optimum. But that even 20% is politically would be really, really difficult, even if you abolish all income taxes. But we wanted something that is somewhat close to what you might call the overall optimum. How well could you do if you wanted to push it? And in this case, you abolish all income taxes completely. The capital asset value tax is also abolished, and you can lower the consumption tax a little bit. And the gain goes from 40% in the baseline to 46%. However, the price of land now drops by even more than in the baseline, 65% instead of 40%. In this case, you could raise 45% of all revenue using consumption, using land taxes, which is quite interesting. This is the blue dashed line that you observe here. So the GDP effects is clearly the largest, but the effects on the land price are also the largest. The final simulation is a small scale land asset value tax. This is based on the idea that, well, politically, this may be 5 percentage points may be too difficult. What if we look at something that is perhaps more doable, more reasonable? What trade-offs do we face? So we assume that the land asset value tax goes from 0.8% to 2.4%, so it triples, whereas the capital asset value tax remains unchanged. In this case, you can lower the capital land income tax to just under 17%, and the labor income tax to around 11%, and the consumption tax rate again remains unchanged. The output gain, however, despite this significantly smaller tax, is 30%. Remember, it was 40% in the baseline. In this case, however, the price of land drops by less than 10% in the short run and increases by almost 40% in the long run. Right, so what you clearly face is a trade-off with the size of your reform. If you go smaller, your land price change is moderated, but the output gain is too. This is that reform. This is the green line with the black dots on it. You see that the GDP effect is the smallest, but the land price effect is actually the most, the best looking if you're a landowner, except in the short run. Even in the short run, it's not, I would argue, that dramatic. Okay, so to summarize, we find that a land asset value tax increase of 5 percentage points from 0.8% to 5.8% in the UK context increases GDP by 40%. This depends on all sorts of aspects of the calibration and preferences, but we were very, very careful with that, and we can justify what we have done. And this is not an outrageous model. This is actually mainstream model. The main contribution, if you like, is for us to be very careful with the data, and with the data, especially on what the tax base is for a land tax, and documenting that tax base is very, very large. For a wealth tax, we get 28%, for an optimal tax, 46%, for a smaller tax, 30%, and except under the small tax, all income taxes can be abolished. Finally, why such large gains for even more modest reforms? Capital taxes do not raise that much revenue, but are very distortionary. Labor taxes raise more revenue, but are also very distortionary. Removing these distortions greatly increases GDP, and thereby the tax base for everything, including consumption, for example, for the consumption taxes, while it doesn't affect spending relative to trend. This is an underlying assumption in our model, but I think it's a realistic one. If the whole economy is booming, why would the government need to spend more? Unless you want to also talk about, well, there's some things that it could productively spend on. We don't want to go into that. And so we leave that constant relative to trend. There are roughly equal contributions to budgetary space from higher non-income tax revenue to GDP ratios, including the land tax, but also the consumption tax, and also the fact that spending and transfers decline relative to GDP because GDP increases so much. So I conclude with something very similar to what Steve started with, the Merle's review, and what they said about this concept. And what they said is that this is such a powerful idea, and one that has been so comprehensively ignored by governments, that the case for a thorough official effort to design a workable system seems to us to be overwhelming. That was 10 years ago, and in light of recent events, I would argue that it is surely more overwhelming now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Just before I ask Charles to say a few words, I note that we haven't yet had any questions gone into the chat, so please feel free to put your questions into the chat, and then we can ask Michael all our difficult questions once Charles has done with his few words. But before we get to the questions, then I'm going to hand over to Charles.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Can you hear me?
I can, yes, yes.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Given the enormous benefits, economic benefits, that Michael has set out very clearly, why has a shift to the land tax not been introduced already? And I think that the answers are essentially political. Over the centuries, the aristocrats have always grabbed the available good land in any country, either by wealth or earlier on by force. And that means that the parties that support the powerful and wealthy are unlikely ever to introduce this kind of tax. I remember that the main effort to introduce a land tax was in Lloyd George's 1910 budget, and that was defeated by the conservative massed ranks in the House of Lords. Although there is a desire by the Conservatives to level up, which a land tax would do, I think that the idea of the Conservatives in the UK or the Republicans in the United States ever introducing this are extremely unlikely. So it will depend on the development of politics quite clearly. Another problem that always occurs is when you introduce a new tax. And in this particular case, the pain in the shape of a decline in the value of land is felt immediately on the introduction of the tax, while the gain from more efficiency and the higher capital accumulation develops more slowly over time. So the pain is clear and immediate. The gain is always theoretical and hypothetical. And the question is, how can you deal with that? And we have certain ideas about that. Again, there are always hard cases when you introduce a new tax. For example, widows with little income and a relatively large amount of land that they have been left with them. One of the old concerns was measurement, but I think Michael has shown that the measurement issues have largely fallen away. The final point that I do want to make, which Michael actually didn't touch on, was that the taxation of property and land has always been a fiscal area which has been devolved to local government rather than centralized government. And if you introduce a land tax and leave it entirely to the local authorities, you can get some severe regressive tendencies in that the wealthiest areas will introduce much lower land taxes in order to maintain their advantages and therefore lower many of the benefits of the whole process. So the question of central versus local in the introduction of a land tax is an important issue which will have to be dealt with. And if you want to leave it local, there would have to be some additional considerations and forms of equalization between areas undertaken in order to maintain the overall benefits of the introduction of a land tax. So my sort of final words are the economics of this issue to introduce a land tax, in my view, like the Merle's report and all the work that Michael has brilliantly done, is, I think, absolutely overwhelming. The question of how to get it in place is a political economy issue, and that is actually much more complicated. And we are very open to ideas that people might have on the best political approach to an introduction of a shift in taxation, which over the long run, as Michael said, would actually benefit everybody, and in many cases, even benefit landowners as well. So that's all I wanted to add.
Thank you very much, Charles. We have a question from Caroline Bentham, though I fear you've just answered it. It's a two-parter. So the first was, why do you think that this suggestion has not gained traction? Which you've told us a few reasons for that. But the follow-up is, what do you think might change that? What do you think might start persuading governments that that this is something they should take seriously?
Well, perhaps I will start. I think we're running into a very, very difficult issue at the moment. The public sector debt ratios have risen enormously. The burden on the system will become greater when nominal income to interest rates rise, as they will. And the burden on the economy will become greater because of the worsening dependency ratio. I think most of the West, irrespective of what happens in Ukraine, is going to face a fiscal problem of a major extent. And if you push up the income and capital taxes, the effect on efficiency and incentives will be enormous. And at some stage, it is quite possible that even a conservative government might be forced into a wholesale reconsideration. And I'm sure that a more left-wing government would certainly be forced into a reconsideration. So I think that the outlook, particularly the fiscal outlook, is sufficiently difficult that issues of this kind will rise in the near future. And a very important point, which Michael emphasized, and I would again emphasize myself, is that a land tax is and can be shown to be considerably better than either a wealth tax or a property tax, which are two alternatives which have at the moment, I think, somewhat more political traction than a pure land tax. They have more political traction, but they're economically worse.
Michael,
I have nothing to add to that. That's exactly, more or less, in spirit, that's what I would have said, yes.
Okay, Resap Gwilym has a question. Does your modeling allow you to consider the distributional impacts of LVT?
Yes, up to a point. So basically, what we have in the paper, but I didn't have time to talk about that today, is one variant of the model that features separate groups of workers, capitalists, and landlords that they all work a bit, but they differ in how much their income depends on income from land and capital. And then we simulate that model and to look at the distributional effects. And we find that obviously for workers and capitalists, the effects are hugely beneficial. The effects for for landlords, if they depend 100% on land, are negative, obviously, but in the long run, not very negative. If, however, they just they have a mix of assets in their portfolio, so that land accounts for 85% or less of their portfolio, then we find in the long run they also benefit. Important point, I don't know the data for the UK, but in the US it's certainly true that the very rich, which tend to be the ones that hold a lot of land, are also very well diversified and would therefore be unlikely to lose.
Thanks, Michael. Barry Naisbitt has a question. One issue often raised concerns those who are asset rich or land rich, but income poor to be able to pay a tax. Any thoughts on that?
Yes. We have, that's something I had to cut out because of the 30-minute limit today. I would otherwise have talked about it. First of all, in the United States, again, we haven't had much time to look at all the UK data that are pertinent to this. But in the US, that group does not own a large share of the overall land stock. So that means fiscally, if one were to try to compensate that group, it wouldn't be very expensive. Compensation could take the form of homestead exemptions, as they are known in the United States, where the building that you live in is exempted, or the land that you live on is exempted. You could have deferrals, you could have outright exemptions. You could also have, as a general feature of a land tax, an exemption that in the limit would amount to something like, depending on how the tax rates are structured, universal basic income. I think Charles has had some thoughts about that. There are various other things that are mentioned in the paper. This is not an insurmountable problem, because, especially because fiscally it isn't that large. It's so easy to always point to the poor widow, and of course, any tax reform has distributional effects. This one is no exception. But when there is such an overwhelming predominance of winners over losers, then the compensation and dealing with that fiscally is something you can afford. Charles, you might want to add to that.
No, I think you raised all the main points. And for the widows, and I think the easiest way to proceed is to allow someone whose income is less than X and whose land tax is more than Y to defer payment until sale or death or transfer of the land. And it's not difficult to do. One needs to do it, and one needs to be very aware of some of the difficult issues, things like land owned by charities, that sort of thing. One's got to be careful of meeting the rough edges which occur whenever you introduce any new kind of tax. And there will always be rough edges, but in general, one can deal with these things.
Thank you. Yeah, as I was thinking of losers there, and the big landowners, and I was thinking of my old Cambridge College, Trinity, that owns a humongous amount of land and would obviously have to pay quite a bit of tax. I suspect, however, they could probably afford it, unlike some of these widows. Issam Samiri has a question. Does the model present a distinguish between residential and non-residential land? Would that be a reasonable approach from a policy perspective? I think I know the answer, but I'll hand to Michael.
The model does not actually, somebody has an echo. The model does not distinguish between a residential and non-residential land. It's a very aggregative macro model, but also we thought that as a first approximation, it would be best to have this tax being uniform for all types of land. But I think if there were reasons for changing that view, we would have to change the model. The model would get more complicated, and we haven't done that yet.
I think that there would be a problem with agricultural land.
Yes.
And it could be dealt with. For example, the value of agricultural land depends on its productivity, and its productivity depends on the application of fertilizers, keeping weeds down, etc. And again, I think what one would do would be to allow as an offset to the tax on agricultural land, which with Michael I would assume to be levied at a constant rate, but we wouldn't allow an offset in the shape of expenditures whose purpose was to maintain the value of that land.
That makes sense to me. I remember from the Merleys review that they made a distinction between land taxes and building taxes, and they were very much of the opinion that residential property, the housing, should be taxed, whereas business property should not. I mean, they were very strong about business rates being abolished and partly replaced by land taxes. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that question, whether we want to think about taxing buildings separately and whether we then treat residential and business differently.
Not me. I remember I think Merleys review, if I get this right, they suggested for residential buildings some variant of a consumption tax, because you're consuming the services from the building, right? That's not something that we're dealing with in our work.
To be fair, I mean the other thing that came out really strongly of the review is the tax system as a whole is a mess, and sometimes there are obvious improvements you can make, but you kind of really need to start addressing the whole system in a way.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I remember reading Martin Wheel's comment on a paper that was associated with Murley's review, where he said sometimes when you listen to the arguments against these forms of taxation, the arguments seem to be the only good taxes are old taxes. But when the tax system is so messy or so complicated, it's not clear that that is true.
So we don't have any questions in the chat box. Please keep adding them. But while we're waiting on that, I had one which was to do with the phasing in the land tax versus raising it immediately. I mean, so my initial thought was you put a tax on land, the value of that land drops essentially 1-for-1 with the tax. The people who own the land at that point in time lose, and then from that point onwards, the tax is essentially non-distortionary. So obviously, those losses might be quite big, so you might want to phase it in. But then, in the phasing it in, is that why you get the kind of the interesting dynamics for the price of land, and maybe there are more losers but losing less, or I don't know. If you could just let me know what your thoughts are in terms of just the phasing in there.
Yeah, I mean, phasing in the tax helps a little bit with the initial drop in the land price. But then it gets technical. What we assume in the model is rational expectations on the part of everybody. So everybody anticipates that in 20 years we'll be having a tax rate of such and such, and they immediately price that into today's price. And so therefore the effect, while it is somewhat muted, is still quite large. Okay. And so, but that was the original reason why we thought about phasing it in the simulations, in order to moderate the initial drop of values. Let me, by the way, in relation to this, say one more thing. But the immediate pain versus the delayed gain. The gain isn't all delayed, in the sense that in terms of taxes overall, the tax burden does not increase under our reform. It is just shifted onto different shoulders. So for some people, the gain will be immediate and quite large. For the particular group of people who depend overwhelmingly on land, there is immediate pain. And the land only regains some, or in some cases more than its original value over time.
Thank you. The question from Ash Knott here: is evasion/avoidance still a big issue here as it is currently? It says, if the identity of the owner and their financial position is difficult to determine/hidden. I guess that's a practical issue about imposing these sorts of land taxes. Any thoughts on that?
I don't understand that, because if you've got the measurement, you know what the value of the land is, and somebody has to pay. And if nobody pays, presumably the government simply goes in and takes over the land. And you can't keep the land unless you have paid or met your requirement in some other way. So somebody has to pay. And okay, it may well be that a Russian really owns it, but it comes through a Cayman hedge fund or something. But somebody has got to make the payment, because if they don't make the payment, the land, which cannot escape, will get taken over. I don't think that's one of the advantages. Given that land is immobile and land is there and its value can be measured, the problems of evasion and avoidance are really minimized compared to any other form of tax other than a consumption tax.
I love the way Michael put it in his slide. Land can't run away. it's, it's very, yeah. Norma Cohen asks, would there be knock-on effects on the banking/lending system from the initial drop in land values, as land is frequently used to collateralize lending?
Yes, it's a good question. And that is indeed something that would need to be taken into consideration. It's a very good question. And I think that does influence the nature and form of the introduction.
Yes, and we actually have, I agree, and we have a lengthy section in the paper that deals with this and how you can buffer these effects. And this is, by the way, this is also one of the reasons why we thought of phasing it in rather than levying it all at once, because this would also, in cash flow terms, make the transition easier for the financial sector. Remember, however, that the financial sector in this economy, once the original problems are overcome, and as I said, this is talked about in the paper, will then have a business sector that is vastly more profitable, vastly more productive, and lending against real physical assets and productive enterprises can really take off.
Thank you. Recep Gwilym again. Much of the reason for the political popularity of income taxes and consumption taxes is that they're based on cash flows, whereas land value taxes, other wealth taxes, are not associated with cash flows and are therefore more painful to implement. Any comments on that issue?
I think that having money to the government is painful under any circumstance.
Yeah, I can certainly agree with that one. Okay, Ashnot has come back on the point about evasion, saying, I'm thinking maybe if the landowner pretends to be poor, e.g. the widow example, then they either don't pay or incorrectly get compensation. So, you know,
Well, my answer was essentially deferment. And if it is deferred, but the deferment is at a reasonable but not extortionate interest rate, the government actually doesn't lose. And also, I think that you would have to show that the owner had a low income tax. And if the owner was abroad, I think that one would be pretty careful about the kind of income tax evidence that a foreign owner was able to produce. You know, say a Russian oligarch who claimed that he didn't have any money and never paid income tax to their own country. I think one would take that with a pinch of salt. There would, I admit there would be problems about people who didn't pay UK income tax and claimed that they had no income. But I think again that they could be reasonably enough handled.
If I may add to that, we recently presented this work in the IMF Fiscal Affairs Department, and there was a lot of interest in it. And with any taxation that you introduce, there are always issues of administering it and making it work in practice, which is what people in FAD, of course, are very familiar with. But there's no reason for thinking that the problems in the case of a land tax would be bigger than what we have with the various income taxes. In fact, in the US case, where I know the data, there are various estimates of the compliance burden of the tax system as it is, and it ranges between 1 and 2.5% of GDP. And one of the participants, that's a lot of money. And one of the participants at the IMF was also saying, yeah, if I think about just how complicated the compliance is with the corporate taxation system in the United States, all the loopholes and all the difficulties of administering that, There's no reason for thinking that a land tax would be more complicated, quite the opposite.
I mean, again, this is a very old argument, and it was put quite forcefully, again, in the Merlees review, is the simpler you make the tax system, the easier you make it to comply with, the less likely you are to see evasion. Okay, I think we're kind of running out of questions at this point, and we've gone an hour already. So unless there are any other burning issues that people want to raise, in which case type very quickly. I just want to say thanks ever so much to Michael and to Charles for the presentation today of their paper. Neil, I don't know if you want to say anything about what we're going to do with the recording or anything like that.
The recordings will be available shortly on our YouTube channel, and then we'll link it off to our website as well.
Thanks. And anyone who would like to follow up on this, I mean, feel free to come initially to myself at NISA, or I'm sure Michael or Charles would be more than happy to engage in terms. As I said, one of the key reasons for having this presentation, for having this discussion, was to really try and think hard about how we might be able to get government to seriously consider what is, economists have long since known is a very sensible way of taxing, and what, as Charles emphasized, in a time where it's getting harder to raise normal taxes as people are getting older, there's more need, a land tax seems very opportune at this particular moment. So, as I said, if people have thoughts as to how we can continue that discussion, how we can get the government actually talking to us about it, they will be more than welcome. And on that note, again, many thanks to Charles and to Michael, to all of you for attending, and hopefully we'll see each other, maybe even in person, pretty soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.